Okay. All right. First of all, I would like to thank you very much, Diego, for organizing this discussion around my book. It's really it's an honor for me too to be here. Um, I think it's going to be fun. I didn't think I would say so, but I have the impression it might be fun. And as we are all suffering from some sort of digital fatigue, uh, I really want to thank you all for being here and to spending some more time in front of your computer. It's very generous of you, and I'm very appreciative. Of course, I would like to thank Adeline and Jonas for accepting to first reading the book and then accepting to discuss it with me. It's really a great honor and pleasure to have you both here. So I think I'm going to be quite short. I plan to speak for 20 minutes, 25 minutes, just to give you an idea of what this book is about. But first, I should say something about the format of the book, because one of the reviewers for the English version said it's impressively compact. It's an impressively compact book, and yes, it is. This is not a monograph. It is not my structure élémentaire de la parenté. I'm not sure I can write such a thick volume. It's supposed to be a book which is theoretically punchy, also with some political ambitions, of course, ethnographical ambitions as well. I will dig into that later. And it's an impressively compact book which constitutes also an overview of my work for the last 15 years. So I'm not sure it's a success. I'm not sure because I have the impression that that I've been trying to put a lot of ideas in there, and that I could have written 4 books out of this. But you'll tell me if it's a success or not. That being said, let me dig into the intentions of the book, and I would say that these intentions are ethnographical, theoretical, and also political. And I've been trying to unite my fieldwork experiences in West Africa, in Guinea, with my fieldwork experiences in Southeast Asia, in Laos, to write this book about nostalgia, about cultural loss and cultural transmission, inviting us to think through a series of contemporary attachments to heritage, culture, and roots. And with the idea also that I was trying to reach a broader audience than only anthropologists. That's also something that I want to make clear from the onset, is that this book was also written to reach a broad audience, heritage people, memory studies people, maybe archaeologists, maybe some psychoanalysts, maybe some students, MA students, PhD students who might be interested in those questions. So that explains the compactness of the book. I wanted it to be theoretically punchy, but also readable for a broader audience than anthropologists only. So the book begins with an observation, and it's the premise of the book. And I call this premise the losing everything, in French, le tout perdre. Based on my field experiences in Guinea, in Laos, but also in Europe, or in particular in Belgium, these are formulas that I've kept hearing in the field. We are losing our culture. We are abandoning our customs. Traditions are being lost. Everything is being swept away. There is nothing left of the past. The young have no more interest in knowing elder stories. And I've heard again and again those diagnoses of cultural loss, which are growing around the world, this nostalgia for lost worlds, in these times of accelerism, of globalization, overheating, would say Thomas Erikson. Indeed, in many parts of the world, there seems to be a current overdose of nostalgia, deployed in universe as diverse as nationalism, heritage policies, vintage consumerism, tourism industries, and religious and ecological movements. In the West, just look at the nostalgic craze glorifying past ways and objects, and that can be observed in the growing success of flea markets and antiques, organic food, natural childbirth techniques, eco-museums, vintage consumption, and etc., etc. I'm sure you can come up also with a lot of examples of such retromania, which also invades modern day new technologies, things of Instagram that makes your present pictures look instantly nostalgic. The entertainment industry is flooded with nostalgic productions, Mad Men, Downton Abbey, and new Star Wars episode, etc., etc. It seems that in our nostalgia, the consuming society reigns the creed of "it was better before." To the extent that loss and nostalgia have become a zeitgeist, I think a zeitgeist, and this nostalgia is framed into a pre-apocalyptic horizon. Just remember Michelet epigraph, the French 19th century historians, when he says, each epoch dreams of the one to follow. It seems to me that today we would absolutely not adhere to such epigraph. At a time of the possible, finger crossed, not a re-election of Donald Trump and the rise of nationalism and populism all over the world, climate change issues, the dramatic effects of neoliberalism, COVID pandemics, etc. It seems that the worst is yet to come, and we live today in a temporality, a pre-apocalyptic temporality, which obviously feeds what Zygmunt Bauman calls this age of nostalgia in his book Retrotopia, which was his last book. As an anthropologist, you wonder, is it the same nostalgia all over the world? Is there a globalization of what a sociologist, Roland Robertson, calls the nostalgic attitude? How is a cultural loss represented in diverse cultural and social environments? But also, how can we grasp as anthropologists the complex processes of cultural loss and transmission? And these are the main underlying questions that have motivated my research over the last 15 years and that are being presented in this impressively compact book. Well, for anthropologists, studying nostalgia and cultural loss resembles a return of the repressed. And we know how primitivist nostalgia played a crucial role in the development of anthropology, with the first ethnographies by the founding fathers of the disciplines, Franz Boas, Malinowski, Evans Pritchard, Marcel Griol, all of which were fueled with a longing for vanishing societies and ruptured equilibrium. And whilst the anthropologists were lamenting the disappearance of exotic societies, folkloric studies were also plunging into this, what Michel de Certeau called rusticophilia, so this love for disappearing rural traditions and this other from the countryside. In 1961, still Claude Lévi-Strauss suggested that anthropology would be called anthropology, a discipline that devotes itself to the study of this process of disintegration in its most highly evolved forms. I call this anthropologist disciplinary nostalgia an exonostalgia, and that's a term I will come back to later. It's I use this term to describe how anthropologists have been obsessed with the cultural loss of others. And I believe that there are still exonostalgists up to this day, and that's something we can also discuss later. I believe that there has been a sort of painful excitement driven by the feeling of attending the end of these worlds, a form of painful jouissance to be there when loss was occurring or supposedly occurring, almost too late. And I love this formula by my friend Ramon Sarro when he said that ethnography is the art of being late. We always have the feeling of arriving too late. That's a discourse that actually many tourists share today when they say, it's good that we're here now, because in 10 years, this all will be gone. So this is the notion of exonostalgia, and I will be coming back to this notion that I've been exploring in the book very much. So for anthropology, the question of nostalgia is as old as the discipline itself. And now I would like for the next 10 or 15 minutes, I would like to follow some of the theoretical avenues I'm following in the book, and two avenues for better understanding of what is nostalgia. One theoretical question about the mechanisms of cultural loss, and then a discussion about the political usage of the cultural trope, the cultural loss trope. Sorry. So the first avenue that I'm taking in the book is that I want to clarify this notion of nostalgia. I want to clarify the fog surrounding the notion. What forms can nostalgia take? And when we identify what nostalgia is, how can we grasp it in thick description? And what I'm trying to show first is that nostalgic longings are multiple. Some authors have highlighted the need to operate distinctions between different types of nostalgia. I'm thinking here of Svetlana Boym, also Dominique Boyer. And the first thing I wanted to do in this book is to add my own modest contribution to better understanding the protein nature of the nostalgic attachment and the emotional and cognitive investments behind them. As in particular, nostalgia can be disconnected from personal experiences of the past. And that's something that interested me very much. About this, I propose a distinction between two forms of nostalgia. Nostalgia for past that has been experienced personally, which I call endo-nostalgia, and a second-hand nostalgia, a vicarious nostalgia, exo-nostalgia. The former involves the personal ownership of the past, the Proust Madeleine being the most emblematic reference of this kind of experience. And the latter refers to nostalgia for a past that one hasn't personally lived, entailing feelings and representation about loss that are detached from the direct experience of loss. Whilst the first, endonostalgia, is a kind of episodic memory in the sense that it connects individuals viscerally to their own past. It allows them to return in their minds to events they've lived themselves. The second one, exonostalgia, the vicarious nostalgia, encompasses a variety of affects and discourses related to loss, but detached from the direct experience of loss. What is interesting is also in exonostalgia, its vicariousness, is that you can feel nostalgic for a moment, for an event, for a period of time for which other people don't feel nostalgic about. That's what exonostalgia is about. It's about its vicariousness. You can feel nostalgic for something, but other people who have lived this event don't feel nostalgic about it. I've been very influenced here by the notion of prosthetic memory that has been developed by a political scientist, Alison Landsberg, in a very interesting study about how knowledge about the Holocaust is circulated among young people in the US. And she's showing how knowledge is being circulated through museum, media, movies, and in schools. And I've been using this notion to better explore this notion of exonostalgia. And I'm sure you can also find many examples in your own life of exonostalgic laments. I'm always using this example with my students because I have nostalgic fantasies about May 68, Mai 68. And I have this imagination about amphitheaters filled with smokes and debates between Foucault, Barthes, and Lacan, and sexual freedom, and etc., etc. And actually, people I've met who have lived this time are not nostalgic about of this time at all. But I've developed this kind of nostalgia for a very exciting intellectual time of May 68. I'm sure that you can also think about your own nostalgic longings. There are different types of exonostalgia. Some can be very emotional, some can be discursive and rhetorical. And in the book, I'm exploring these different types of exonostalgia based on my fieldwork first in Luang Prabang in northern Laos, which is a former royal town, which has become a World Heritage Site in 1995, and which I have described as an arena for the deployment of different types of nostalgias, a nostalgiascape, if you want, although this term doesn't add anything to what I'm trying to describe, but the deployment of different types of nostalgia, from the nostalgia of the bureaucrats in Paris, the nostalgia, the exonostalgia of the tourists, and the nostalgia of the expatriates, the nostalgia of the refugees, the exilees returning back to Laos after decades spent in France or in the US, and also with the local forms of nostalgia, which very often are different from the experts' nostalgia or the tourist nostalgia. So I've been trying to describe the multiplicity, the complexity of this scene in northern Laos with different types of nostalgia and different types of cognitive and emotional investments. Besides my former fieldwork in West Africa, in Guinea, I've been also interested in issues of exonostalgia already at the time, although I think I didn't know by then that that's what I was interested in. But I've been very interested at the time by how urban elites who have left the village 20, 30, 40 years ago have developed exonostalgic longings for a ritual past they haven't experienced, which is this time of custom, which is seen by many as a very powerful time when the Bulongich people, which is the name of the people where I've worked at the time, were extremely strong, ritually loaded, and it's very interesting to see how these urban elites who have been educated in Western style school have developed this nostalgia for a ritual past they haven't experienced themselves, and now they're in the process of trying to preserve this ritual past, to store it, to record it, and they adopt this preservationist posture, which contradicts very much the attitude of the elderly people in the village who have been initiated, but also with the young villagers. So the first aspect I've been trying to develop in this book is the multiplicity of nostalgic longings. The second aspect, the second theoretical avenues is about the very texture, the very nature of nostalgia as an emotion. And I'm trying to show in the book that nostalgia is not a feeling, is not only a feeling located in the confines of the self. It's also an emotion, and an emotion that does something to the world. It's a social force that produces effects in the world. I love this sentence by Milan Kundera in The Unbearable Lightness of Being, when he writes, "In the sunset of dissolution, everything is illuminated by the aura of nostalgia, even the guillotine." Meaning that nostalgia can even alter your perception and transform the ugly into the beautiful. And there is something very interesting into the performative dimension of nostalgia, what it does to the world in which we live. And for that matter, and that's what I've been exploring in the book, I look at what happens when nostalgia, and what nostalgia produces in the production of heritage, as by attempting to preserve spaces, practices, and objects, UNESCO experts, national heritage experts, and professionals, but also urban elites, often gather together in communities of loss, whether in Guinea, in Laos, or elsewhere in the world. They actually transform those practices, those spaces, and those objects. Heritage recognition and UNESCO heritage recognition creates new aesthetical forms, new historical narratives, new politics of transmission, and new social configurations. And so that's what I wanted to show in the book, is that nostalgia is multiple, but it's also performative. It has a transformative dimension. The third ambition of the book, and probably the most difficult one, as I'm I see this book only as an opening to that question. It's about our understanding as anthropologists of the mechanisms of cultural loss and transmission. And I believe anthropologists have something to say. They can offer some new perspectives about those questions. As whilst we describe diagnosis of cultural loss, we describe what people say about what they lose, and we can have access from the inside to the way in which societies do problematize cultural loss and transmission. I think that we also have something to bring about the mechanisms, the workings of cultural loss and transmission. And in that domain, there is still a lot of ground to be cleared to better understand why certain practices and representation continue to be, or some other are being lost. And for that regard, I always, when I speak about that, I give an illustration taking this very interesting story from, which is told by Gershom Scholem, the Jewish historian and philosopher in his major trends in Jewish mysticism, published in 1941. And he borrows this story from the Jewish Hasidic tradition of Eastern Europe. And to me, it provides a great illustration of the complexities of transmission and loss. And this is how the story goes. It's a very short story, but I give it to you because it's extremely illustrative of what I want to talk about. And this is the story. Whenever the Baal Shem Tov, who was an 18th century rabbi and founder of Hasidism, had a difficult task to accomplish, he would go to a specific location in the forest, light a fire, and pray. And generation after generation, his successors were still pious men, but the next generation, the rabbi would still go to a specific location in the forest. He would pray, but he wouldn't light a fire. And then the next generation, another rabbi would still go to the forest, but he would have forgotten to light a fire and to pray. And as a result, subsequent generation of rabbis no longer said the Baal Shem Tov prayer, lit a fire, or even knew where to pray, but they continued nonetheless to tell this story as a way of honoring God. And I think this story is an extraordinary illustration of what this book is about also, is that I try to open a series of questions about cultural loss and transmission workings, which very often doesn't happen where we expect it to happen. It's not linear. It's not the simple replication from generation to generation. Transmission is a very complex process made up of rupture, misunderstanding, silences, emotions, which takes place within very specific temporal ontologies, etc., etc. And I think as anthropologists, we can have something to say to better understand the elusive realities of cultural loss and transmission. Where does transmission begin? How can we grasp and quantify loss? Here we touch at some of the fundamental mechanisms of culture and its persistence or not. These are crucial questions to anthropologists, and they provide the basis for reflection about the continuity of human societies facing the ruptures of history. And then the last point, and I'm really finishing, Diego, so I just need 2 minutes more. But then the last dimension that I'm trying to explore in this book, and I'm trying to bring forward, is, I would say, political. It is not the center of the book. It's more like a general frame. It's an atmosphere, if you want to say, an ambiance of the book, a word which is cherished by heritage experts, actually. It's a little bit of the spirit of the book. And the spirit of the book is also digging into a cultural loss as a political weapon. Politicians today, and mostly rightish and extreme rightish politicians, are using the trope of losing culture to express all sorts of hate and discrimination. As, for instance, when Donald Trump claims that Europe is losing its culture because of immigration. The white supremacists in the US are under the impression that white culture is threatened by other ethnic groups. And the same discourse is found in Europe with regional variants and different intensities, where many emphasize their fear of losing their local culture, threatened by the presence of other cultural minorities, Muslims in particular. So on the one hand, we are facing this reactionary nostalgia, which is ranting against multicultural policies and so-called ethnicization of countries. On the other hand, we also can observe that certain groups and individuals are using the rhetoric of losing culture for the purpose of social recognition of their traumas and traumatic histories. And so it's a very tense field, I would say, a tense arena in which extreme rightish and rightish politicians are using this rhetoric, whilst other communities are also using the rhetoric of losing culture in order to advance social recognition of their traumatic history. With regard to that, I think we as anthropologists also have something to say. First, because we can take such a rhetorics of losing culture, of cultural decline and decay as object of study, and we can show that this rhetoric is very old, tracing back to Greek and Roman antiquity till the German Romantics, and how in the history this rhetoric, political rhetorics of losing culture has been used to castigate on some categories of people. Remember how the Jews have been accused in the 30s of being responsible for the decline of moral order, of catalyzing the decline and decay. And we can document how this rhetoric of losing culture is being used politically for centuries. But also as anthropologists, and I will finish with that, as anthropologists, we can also counter these kind of arguments by showing how wrong they are. And that thanks to heritage policies and these new technologies of storage, as a matter of fact, culture has never been as well preserved as today. Culture has never been more preserved than before, precisely because of heritage policies and new technologies of storage. That's it for now. Thank you very much for listening. So now I'm really eager to get your comments and feedbacks. Thank you very much. Thank you, Diego.
Thank you very much, David. That was a absolutely brilliant presentation. Our first discussant is Adeline Masquelier. Adeline, to you.
Thank you, Diego, and thank you, David, for inviting me to participate in this discussion. I really enjoyed the book. It's so well written, it's so evocative, yet also incisive. I think the range of ethnographic, personal, theoretical perspectives that David brings to bear on his argument is really dazzling. He navigates very deftly between belonging nostalgia and Laotian imagined losses, as well as other contexts. I mean, you're asking yourself, David, you know, am I saying too much in too little? I think what you're doing, I mean, there's an economy of word that's matched by an elegance of argumentation. And so I was really impressed. I was really just dazzled. For me, the book is especially relevant and timely and powerful because, well, I live in the US, a country where people are currently massively going to the polls to hopefully vote out of office an individual who has so expertly and effectively exploited people's yearnings for a glorious past, right? A past with stable livelihoods, vibrant working class communities, a past with social mobility tied to education, good salaries, and so on. I mean, just the very acronym of MAGA, right? Make America Great Again, is the most powerful sort of message of nostalgia. One could argue that it is about the loss of a particular world of value, a loss of culture, but not in the way that the belonging people see it, nor in the way that it is described in Luang Prabang. So, I mean, in some ways, it's not clear what kind of America people are talking about, what it is that they're yearning for, but that's irrelevant. MAGA, the very acronym, smuggles all kinds of nostalgia. And I hadn't realized this until I read your book, David. And And in fact, you yourself say, page 16, you say that in truth, I'm not sure that we know what it is that we don't want to lose, right? So I think a great quality of this book is that it speaks beyond the particularities of the cases at hand. Now, what David has captured so well, I think, is the mode in which people live and experience the loss, the way they talk about it. He puts it very eloquently, page 37, when he says that, okay, and by the way, I read the French version, so I don't know, every time I'm gonna sort of quote David, I'm actually translating, it's my own translation. So page 37, David speaks of belonging people, and he says, on parle de la coutume à l'imparfait, tandis que la religion musulmane se dit au présent. So one speaks of custom in the imperfect tense, which has all kinds of resonances, right? Whereas the Muslim religion is spoken in the present tense. And I think that, first, it's so beautifully said, but I think it captured so well what's going on. So you were asking us just a minute ago, David, whether the book is successful. Well, it really transported me. It made me want to read every author, every source that you mentioned in the bibliography. And I realized I haven't read a lot of those texts, so I have a lot of work to do. You also speak, I think, in the conclusion of trouver le mot juste, finding the right word. And I think you have. I mean, you're a gifted writer. To me, that is a measure of success. At the same time, if I'm allowed to play devil's advocate, I wonder what the limits of nostalgia are. Limits in both senses of the term, right? What is not nostalgia? So is there a danger that if everything can be turned into nostalgia, the concept kind of loses its analytical usefulness? Should we use nostalgia in the plural? So I want to ask you three questions, David. So my first question is, what your book very, made me realize is that it is only when you're about to lose your culture that you actually possess it. I mean, there's a sort of paradox here, right? It seems that to lose something, you have to possess it in the first place. And yet it's clear that what people mean by culture, what people mean by having culture is vastly different. In fact, in Laos, people can complain that culture is being shoved down their throat. So they don't exactly own it. So I wonder about this. Can you describe culture only at the moment of loss? I think that really, to me, is a kind of an interesting paradox, and perhaps an interesting way for some of us who might be interested in picking up where you left. But I wonder what you might say about this. The second question has to do with the page 94 in the book, in the French book. You say, nous ressentons seulement de la compassion envers les petites gens. We only feel sorry, we only feel empathy for humble people, for little people, for poor people. And so I wonder here, are we talking about culture, or are we talking about capital? To what extent, again, this kind of nostalgia smuggles in all kinds of losses that are not necessarily about culture, but about life in the sense of prosperity, in the sense of middle-class stability. So are we concerned about class, or are we concerned about post-industrial, neoliberal, structurally adjusted societies where people are struggling to survive economically? And I think I know that you've sort of brought it up in your presentation, but I thought maybe you might want to go back to it. And then the third question has to do with the whole business of going native. I wasn't convinced. And maybe it's just because I don't feel like I've ever gone native. I'm not even sure what that means. I think that for me, when I go to Niger, I don't feel that I'm going native. Perhaps I'm putting on a show. I tell people that I'm religious. I tell people that I do this, that I do that. But I'm not sure that it can be captured by the way in which you talk about un déplacement vertigineux, a vertiginous sort of displacement of identity between identity and alterity. Maybe I'm just playing devil's advocate, but I wondered what your experience of going native was, and if you think that can be sort of, if there isn't too much of a kind of, you know, a way in which we assume that everyone has that same experience. So thanks again for the opportunity to, you know, to participate in this discussion, and I'm looking forward to your responses.
Thank you very much, Adeline, for these very perceptive observations and also for tracing such convincing and yet tragic parallels with contemporary politics. Our next discussant is Jonas Tinius. Please, Jonas, go ahead.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can see and hear me. Before we begin, I have to say that despite the terrible state of the world, I mean, it's literally burning around us, and despite the unsatisfactorily haptic experience of Zoom, I really also appreciate the possibilities afforded by the digital spontaneity of such meetings. I mean, it moves me really to see old friends. Hello, Cassian. Hello, Alex. And colleagues that I've never met but always appreciated. So salut, David. And I'd also like to say that the informality and the glitches are all part of this new world now. And I think that we should know as anthropologists that this is going to be the new normal. So excuse the kids shouting in the background, the clinking of glasses in this cafe, the internet breakup that will undoubtedly happen, or the random cat that may cloud the screen. Hello, John. But to get into this book, let me say that it's really a pleasure to discuss a book that manages to do what all good anthropology should be doing, saying something new or surprising or something illuminating about things we thought we already knew, like heritage or loss or culture. Or in fact, to quote one of David's interlocutors, Moladok Monahok, or heritage is hell. But besides the pleasure of reading David's book, it's also an immense pleasure, I have to admit, to be reading his uplifting, cynical Facebook posts. And I'm really delighted to be at least in a slightly more human interface with him now, because I actually think that we've never really had a chance to meet. And I don't really know what kind of culture we're losing by opening a comment on a wonderful book like this, but there we are. I'd also like to flip through the book now, like dramatically, to show you that I've actually read it, but unfortunately my pen exploded halfway through reading it, and it looks like I've suffered a fairly dramatic paper cut more than anything else, so just believe me that I was there. This wonderful book is, in my view, addressing one of the most fundamental issues of the modern world, and it continues to be so about the present day. Loss, nostalgia, and the projection of our fear of loss onto others. From nativist anthropologists to identitarian nationalists, we witness the performative rhetorics of loss. And we see that despite the best efforts of generations of scholars, from Hobsbawm to Anderson and Trouillot, the rhetorics of eternity, authenticity, and the necessary return to the real is politically efficacious. Make America great again. Do not restitute African heritage. Rebuild the Berlin City Palace. I could, and I'm sure we all could, enumerate the examples in which the rhetorics of loss and reconstruction prevail in the present. My own escape from this heritage politics by focusing on contemporary art does not, in fact, evade the issue, as David also somewhat illustrates in his second chapter. And in fact, it is in his discussion of Baga society customs that I felt the most poignant reminder of something to be acutely aware of. Musing on his own ethnographic nostalgia, confronting what appears to be the loss of a ritual custom and knowledge attested to by the elders, David cannot help but himself appear somewhat disappointed. And yet what he notes so importantly, this disappointment was itself a projection. And more than that, it was a result of taking seriously the elders' frustration at the expense of watching the younger generation's faith in a revival of custom. And this, for me at least, is a fascinating case of taking too seriously our interlocutors and projecting our own nostalgia onto the fields and movements that we observe. The forces of nostalgia are themselves, as David points out, complex, ambiguous, and contested. And just as we see its tentacles invade every part of our lives, we may have to be careful with not projecting our own nostalgia onto that of others. Where some may see loss, others may see gain. I find this an incredibly important reminder for our times, and I really thank David for bringing it to my and to all of our attention, especially because it is not just a comment on our own sentimental education as professional, but a point about the wider politics of memory. I think David is right in pointing out that we need to be cautious about the ways in which we are complicit in a museumification of others and their memory, as in, for example, the debate about restitution across European museums, about how we position so-called source communities in a fixed idea of social life. Likewise, I think that we need to be extra cautious about our complicitness in the construction of heritage professionalism, and to keep more porous the understandings of materiality, objecthood, and memory, to allow for apoptotic archives, as my colleague, the curator Bonaventure Ndikon points out, something resembling the structure of the conjecture evoked by Marshall Salins, and which allows us to ask ourselves seriously what is remembered in whose name. In Berlin at the Institute of European Ethnology, where I was based for a long time, we've witnessed this firsthand, where following street activism, activist scholarly engagement by colleagues, the racially connoted street of the Moor, Mohrenstraße, was renamed in honor of the first Black German philosopher, Wilhelm Anton Amor. So I'm grateful for David's bold recognition of the professionally institutionalized nostalgia in Western heritage institutions, because it allows for a greater and more systematic analysis of us moderns, something that I think we anthropologists in traditions of social and cultural anthropology have neglected for too long. Focusing myself, for instance, on the museification of Germany's most celebrated heritage institutions, the theater and the anthropological museum, we must look back at ourselves. The battle over heritage fought in these days between activists taking back objects from the Quai Branly, for instance, is not a battle of Africans versus Europeans. It's a battle over the sovereignty of the very interpretative capacity to define the future of world heritage, which has become much more porous and distributed than many among us dare to accept. So go and read this impressively compact book. And please take the time also, I have to say, to skim the endnotes, because it's one of the places where the compactness is expanded. And lastly, I'd also like to give a shout out to the translator, Dominic Horsfall, because I think he's really done a great job in rendering, David, your sense of humor and poignancy at the same pace. So thank you everybody for listening. And I'm happy that the connection seemed to have worked until now.
Well, thank you very much, Jonas. David, would you like to address very briefly these very rich comments?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. But first of all, I would like to thank very much Adeline and Jonas for the very generous comments, and I feel very grateful that you have been, reading the text in depth in French, Adeline, and in English, Jonas. So really, thank you very much, and it's really good to receive all this positive feedback on my work. And I will join Jonas in the sense that this digital, I was extremely, of course, stressed about this digital event, and I thought that we all suffer from digital fatigue and etc. But I realize how comforting it is also that we can still, share something through those digital technologies, and I'm so happy to see that friends have joined, and I feel it's really, I feel really privileged today to be part of this. So thank you very much to all of you, and in particular to Diego, Adeline, and Jonas. To Adeline, I mean, we could discuss for hours about the question you have asked, and I agree very much with the risk of very broad usage of the notion of nostalgia, and that's what, and I'm still struggling with that. So I cannot. I'm very happy that you are pointing to this question, because the same as the notion of memory, we tend to use nostalgia to describe a diversity of emotional and cognitive experiences, and that's why I'm very eager also to receive any kind of comments that could help me to refine this typology that I'm trying to build between exonostalgia and endonostalgia. And I think it works. I think it works, but it can be refined. And actually, that's the objective of a typology, is that you need to refine it with case studies and with illustration from the field. I like very much, Adeline, your comment about the fact that it seems that we take culture seriously, or we start grasping a culture as an object when we lose it. And I think there is something, and that's what I said, that in the presentation of the book, there was something happening when the first generation of anthropologists were observing these societies, what they would see as disappearing societies, is that they felt this kind of painful jouissance to observe disappearance in the making. And that's something I cannot explain so far. I cannot explain what is this affect, what is maybe you can also help me in the discussion later to understand what is the very nature of this aspect, this affect, to somehow feel as a privileged observer of the disappearance. And look at the way we love ruins. We love to watch ruins. We love to see disappearing architectures, and we think it has a charm, it has a spirit, it has something. So there is something to dig there. I don't think this feeling is shared all over the world. I think it is an affect that we could clearly connect to the history of heritage in the West. But well, that's something that needs to be delved into further. Then for your last question about the business of going native, that's a chapter I'm very fond of, I have to say, although because I wanted to connect the question of losing culture to the situation in which anthropologists can experience the feeling of loss in the practice of fieldwork. And I wanted to connect a discussion about heritage to the phenomenological experience of what you lose, or do you lose something in the process of conducting fieldwork, and through the lens of becoming native. But I agree very much that the way I grasp this becoming native idea is still too sculptural. It's not refined enough, and that's why now actually I'm working more to try to understand what are the kind of process of identification through which we go when we conduct a particular observation, or when we do acting, or when we perform cosplaying, or when we want to become an animal as a furry fan, etc. Because I think that in the book I'm missing something about the complexity of the immersive practices and the identification process. But I believe, but it's my experience as an anthropologist. It's also an experience for other anthropologists that I'm documenting in the book. Although it's also part of a myth for anthropologists to present themselves as becoming native. But in my experience, this process of indigenization, as I call it, has been quite intense, attending, participating in a lot of rituals, viscerally engaging myself with the real of the other. And maybe it's because it was my first fieldwork in my early 20s. It was very intense. It was probably a little bit of hysteria, fieldwork hysteria. I don't know, but it's at the same time a narrative which is used by anthropologists to define what they do, but it's also, I think, a kind of experience that needs to be described. And I'm not sure that I'm describing it well enough in the fourth chapter of the book. It needs to be refined. I'm not sure I would use now anymore the formula living the self. I think it's more complicated than that. Let's wait for the next essay I'm going to write about that. But I agree, it's an important question. Voilà, Diego.